Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests. Welcome to the Rcsi Bahrain Annual Research Conference 2021 on this absolutely gorgeous day. In the last few days it's been very windy, but today's is perfect. Just in time for what is going to be a superb morning and excellent presentations. We'd like to thank His Excellency Lieutenant General Dr. Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdullah Al Khalifa, Chairman of the Supreme Council of Health, for his patronage for this event. Could I have the next slide, please? Just a few housekeeping things to mention. This is a live event on MS Teams. This event is recorded. And please have only one MS Teams connection open in the room, so don't connect your laptop and phone. Use the question and answer function to share your queries or your questions with us, please. And there's a slight delay in the broadcast, so please bear with us. There's going to be no microphones and videos will not be available during the conference. So therefore, if you do have any questions, please put them through the chat function. Could I have the next slide, please? Shown here is the agenda for the conference for this morning. We will have our opening address by His Excellency, Lieutenant General Dr. Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdullah Al Khalifa, Chairman of the Supreme Council of Health. This will be followed by a welcome address by Professor Fergal O'Brien. We will then go into our plenary session with our four presenters. And at the end of that, there will be the opportunity for question and answers. So please post your questions in the actual chat function. We will then go into the 6 oral presentations of the research abstracts overview, and these are the top 6 scoring of the 62 abstracts that we received, following which we will announce the winners and then close the meeting. Next slide, please. So without further ado, I would like to invite our patron, His Excellency Lieutenant General Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdullah Al Khalifa, Chairman of the Supreme Council of Health, to give his opening address. Thank you.
Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me a great pleasure to be addressing you today at the Rcsi Bahrain Annual Research Conference. I would like to start by acknowledging the outstanding efforts made by the Kingdom in dealing with the pandemic. Under the guidance of His Royal Highness Prince Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa, the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Bahrain, we are one of the best countries in tackling COVID-19, and this has been specifically commended on 2 occasions by the World Health Organization. Our efforts have been reflected by the high recovery rate and low death rate in the country, and more than 12% of the population has already received both doses of the vaccination through our rolling vaccination program. I want to take the opportunity today to extend my sincere thanks to the Rcsi alumni who volunteered in their time and efforts to support the national clinical trials, and also the nursing students of Rcsi Bahrain for participating in the national vaccination campaigns. Continuous research has always been the essence of the enhancement and development of all aspects of the healthcare, and with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the value and impact of conducting research has significantly multiplied. I would like to acknowledge the contribution of Rcsi Bahrain in supporting the national clinical trials in Bahrain, which has impacted the way we have managed and responded to the pandemic. I also congratulate Rcsi Bahrain in establishing clinical trials unit within the Bahrain Oncology Center. This research is instrumental to our national strategy for identifying the best COVID-19 treatment and will be utilized in the future to pursue further national healthcare research projects. Finally, I would like to congratulate the Rcsi Bahrain Professor Stephen Atkin and his colleagues on hosting this research conference. I am confident that it will be enriching and a terrific showcase of the great research efforts ongoing within Bahrain.
Thank you very much indeed, Your Excellency, for that excellent presentation. I would now like to the welcome address given by Professor Fergal O'Brien, who is the Director of Research and Innovation at Rcsi Dublin. Professor Fergal, the floor is yours.
So good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Rcsi Bahrain Annual Research Conference. My name is Fergal O'Brien. I'm the Professor of Bioengineering and Regenerative Medicine and the Director of Research and Innovation in Rcsi Dublin. And I would really like to be there today to join you, and I'm hopefully maybe by the end of the year I'll be able to get out there soon to meet everyone in Bahrain. But unfortunately, due to travel restrictions, it's not possible to be there physically today. But I've been looking at the program, and it looks like an exceptional program that's planned for today's event. It's been a really great year for research, despite all the challenges that the COVID pandemic has created for everyone around the globe. But I've been hugely impressed at the amount of activity that's taken place in Rcsi Bahrain over the past year. And I've had some direct involvement with this activity through the work that our Office of Research and Innovation in Dublin has been providing with working with Professor Atkin's team in establishing the clinical trial unit. And it's great to see this unit begin to expand and a really strong framework put back in place. And we've also provided support in Dublin in clinical trials planning support through GCP courses to the local trial personnel. And I think this is great at ensuring that the same standards in clinical trials planning are maintained in Bahrain as are carried out in Dublin. And of course, this gives great confidence as we establish this unit and as more trials begin to go into the unit. And we're also beginning to see the outputs from this, because 2 national COVID-19 clinical trials have now been carried out, sponsored by Rcsi Bahrain. The first of these is complete, and it's fantastic to see the outputs from this accepted for publication in scientific reports. And the second one is ongoing, but will be complete within the next few weeks. And I think this is a very positive development. Related to this, and something that I also think is hugely positive, is to see collaboration with industry and industry income coming into the college in Bahrain. And seeing also funding for the development of a clinical trial. And I know that Professor Atkin and his team have got great ambitions to bring more clinical trials, industry co-funded clinical trials into this unit as we go forward. But I think this is a really exciting development. Also, another new course that's being planned or has been established now in Bahrain is the implementation of a research integrity course in collaboration with our School of Postgraduate Studies in Dublin. And again, a bit like our GCP course, this ensures that standards for research integrity are maintained to the same level in Bahrain as we carry out in Dublin. And these are directed by the government, the Irish government, to state agencies such as Science Foundation Ireland and Dublin. So I think this is a really positive development as well too. Another major development that augurs very well for the future and for the development of and growth of research activity in Rcsi Bahrain is the new Clinical and Biomolecular Research Unit at King Hamad University Hospital. And I think this scale of this investment and the ability of this research infrastructure to attract new studies and to grow and develop existing ones is a very, very positive departure. And I'm really looking forward to visiting the unit when I get out to Bahrain next and to see the outputs from this over the coming years. Something else I should mention is the Dillman program, PhD program between RCSI Dublin and Bahrain. The final Dillman scholars will be finishing this year, and I should congratulate Ashang Luanglueva for carrying out and finishing his PhD studies, which was carried out under the direction of Dr. Michael Kyo in RCSI Bahrain in partnership with the Tissue Engineering Research Group in Dublin. And I'm delighted that Ashang is staying on post-PhD to carry out postdoctoral work and to make sure that the knowledge that he's developed will continue to benefit the group in Bahrain. And I suppose Ashang has a number of papers published over the past year, and I think it's great to see that the publication output in Bahrain continuing to develop. And it's notable that even in quarter one of this year, that the average impact factor of these journals that people are publishing in is continuing to increase all the time. And again, with all these exciting initiatives and with a plan for growth in the future, I think it's truly an exciting time for research in RCSI Bahrain. And I can't wait to get out and to meet people face to face. So with that, I'd wish you all the best for a truly exciting day. And like I said, I'll look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Fergal, for your welcome address. So now we're going into the plenary session, and the first presenter is Professor Thomas Walsh, and the presentation is From the Particular to the Universal. Over to you, Professor Walsh.
Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I feel very honoured to have been asked or provided with the opportunity to speak at this meeting, and I must thank Professor Atkin for his kind invitation, and I hope that my presentation will be sufficiently provocative to justify his faith in me. Next slide, please. As a clinician for over 40 years, we have focused on history, examination, and increasingly during the pandemic period, we have bemoaned the relegation of detailed history taking and examination because of the circumstance we find ourselves in. Because wise clinicians weigh up the relevant information of every disease and every patient. We look at the clinical picture, we look at the physiological environment, the biochemistry, and we ask a question all surgeons ask, are the findings on imaging and on special investigations supported by the clinical findings? This is so important for a surgeon. And so important because the surgeon has ultimately to make a decision, do I manage this patient conservatively or do I have to intervene? My first and greatest mentor used to always ask the question, what's the right thing for this patient? Next slide, please. Because every patient is different and one patient will present with a novel observation, a novel observation of his disease or an unusual presentation or have an unusual complication or an unexpected response. And while we deal with every single day, we deal with our individual cases, case reports now have been made redundant. They're impossible to publish, and precedence is given to large multi-center randomized trials or large multi-center studies, multi-institutional studies. Next slide, please. I might remind ourselves that the Royal Society was founded in 1760 to discuss individual cases, and their motto was nullus in verba, basically don't take people's word for it, experiment and see for yourself, speak to the patient. And as medical students, we learn from a series of individual cases. And I like the story of Jenner's vaccination journey. Was really endorsed when he met a milkmaid and he was concerned about her getting smallpox, and she said, but Dr. Jenner, I can't get the smallpox because I've had the cowpox. or when Horace Wells saw an acquaintance injure himself and not know it, and pointed out to him, and when he realized that the patient or the person had taken nitrous oxide, this was the origin of anesthesia, which changed the course of surgery. And of course, Isaac Newton only needed one apple to fall for his theory of gravity to be triggered. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. Randomized trials are important. Of course, they're important. But introduced in the late 1940s, they were very important in teasing out the correct management for tuberculosis. First, streptomycin was trialed and it seemed to work, but on long-term follow-up it failed. And then the triple therapy was found to work. And randomized trials have established their place at the heart of medicine and have become the currency of medicine. But there are limitations to randomized trials, and there are certain biases that can creep in, and I want to deal with one of those shortly. And we have worked hard to try and iron out these possible glitches in trial design and trial registration in CONSORT criteria. But despite the fact that many trials fail these standards, they still are used to inform clinical decision making. Next slide, please. And there are so many barriers to clinical trial participation for clinicians with their time constraints, patient constraints, etc. There are so many limitations. But having taken that on board, we must understand that a trial cohort will often will only share perhaps age and gender as their common bond. All of the individual characteristics of the trial patients are lost, and they're all amalgamated. Next slide, please. I want to give you one example of this, a single example here in my field of expertise, and this pointed out to me how we can get things so wrong. Laparoscopic cholecystectomy has become the standard of care for gallbladder disease, and it's one of the operations that we perform most frequently. And we have ironed out a lot of the difficulties and a lot of the concerns and the indications, etc. But one big issue has always been, what is the correct timing to perform laparoscopic cholecystectomy? When do you perform it? Do you perform it when the patient presents, or do you wait until the patient's condition has settled? But essentially, what I'm saying here is that the question has been asked: should we perform this early or late? Should we perform it early or when the patient has settled? And how do we judge? Do we look at the cost? Do we look at patient quality of life? Do we look at patient safety? And what do we base it on? What do we base our decisions on? So we have a number of randomized trials. Next slide. Next slide. 15 randomized trials in all were carried out to examine this issue. Next slide. The randomized trials, 15 randomized trials, were meta-analyzed in detail, And the conclusion was that early laparoscopic cholecystectomy was as safe as delayed cholecystectomy, but it won out over cost and over patient comfort. So the conclusions were that, as I said, that early cholecystectomy seemed best. However, at about the same time, a prospective registry data was examined, or a prospective registry was constructed in the UK. And you can read from the introduction here that the authors are impatient with the implementation of emergency cholecystectomy, because they say that randomized trials, meta-analyses and expert consensus support the use of emergency cholecystectomy for most patients presenting with biliary colic, etc. Now, I'll just ask you to remember 2 or 3 numbers here for a moment. In this presentation, 16% of patients only had emergency cholecystectomy. The vast majority had elective cholecystectomy. And the mortality rate, forget about the other complications, the mortality rate was 0.2%, 1 in 500. Next slide, please. Now, in another jurisdiction, they looked at 58,000 cholecystectomies, every cholecystectomy carried out in the region, in the Westphalia region, over a 4-year period. And they looked at 58,000 patients. And this was a quality control database where every gallbladder operation was registered. Next slide, please. And you can see in the introduction, they said that early laparoscopic cholecystectomy is the mainstay of treatment. And they said that they do caution at the end, besides the extent of gallbladder inflammation might influence surgical outcome. Now, a clinician of several years experience would never make a statement like that, because a clinician would say that the extent of gallbladder inflammation will certainly influence outcome. Next slide, please. And these are the references that they use to justify the role of early cholecystectomy. The first is a randomized trial, one of the 15. The second is a meta-analysis from the Cochrane database systematic review. The third is a randomized trial that does not, I repeat, does not address the issue, because it compares emergency laparoscopic cholecystectomy with operating between day 6 and 6 weeks, a time that nobody in the UK, Ireland or Bahrain would operate. And the fourth is just laparoscopic cholecystectomy in males, and there's no relevance. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, I just want to draw your attention to grade 5 at the bottom line. Next slide, please. The bottom line here is the complications. Grade 5 complications are death, they're mortality. Remember, in the British data for 9,000 patients, the mortality was 0.2%. The control group here, the column on the right, are the patients who had merely had inflammation. They had acute inflammation, and they were operated on early, but they didn't have an empyema. But 1.2% of that cohort died. And the patients who had empyema, which were a quarter of the patients, 2.8% died. Next slide, please. The overall mortality from the 45,000 patients, and that's every patient who had a cholecystectomy over that time period in Westphalia, was 1.7%, or 1 in 60. Remember, compared to 1 in 500. So that was a failure at so many levels of randomized trials to address the issue at hand. Next slide, please. What I find fascinating about the paper, well, a few things. They didn't report on the outcome of those patients who had an elective cholecystectomy, or those patients who were converted to open, etc. But I think the bigger issue with that paper is that these data have not been questioned in the literature. This data is in the literature for 4 years, 5 years, and there is a 10% difference in mortality. And if that was a difference in infant mortality between countries, I think we would have people leaping up and down. Or if it was a difference in outcome between different ethnic groups, for instance, one would think it would be addressed. There have been 19 citations of the paper, 5 or 6 by the authors, 2 by myself, and a number of others saying these things happen. Next slide, please. I have been very interested in that particular data set, and I have contacted the authors and I have tried to drill into it a little further. But the problem, of course, is that the data is contained in charts, in hospital charts, and it is impossible to retrieve. And we've all labored at the coalface of retrospective studies, dusting down charts, because these data are all contained. But now you could ask yourself, what if all of that information was on computer? Next slide, please. For the past 4,500 years, we have recorded patient data. These are cuneiform tablets from the Sumerian civilization. They were the first to record patient information, and they recorded them on tablets of stone, and these are tablets of clay, and these little clay tablets were about the size of a mobile phone. And they recorded these patients' histories and would put them in their pocket. And this, in fact, is a prescription recorded for a patient. And they take out their prescription and look and see what had been prescribed by the physician 4,500 years ago. And for the next 4,500 years, we've done the same thing. We've committed our findings to paper, to papyrus, or to cuneiform tablets. But in the last decade, there has been a revolution, because we have now committed all of this data to computer. And it has come at a time when data doubling time has increased. At one time, data doubling occurred every century. Now, data, on the last time I checked, data doubled every 73 days. And while we can address so many issues with randomized trials, there is a limit to the amount of questions we can ask of randomized trials, etc. So if we get back to focus on case histories, on clinical findings, on the patient's histology and biochemistry, and it's all recorded, it's available to us. Next slide, please. It's all digitized, it's all available to the healthcare service, and countries spend billions on healthcare, and the state should be able to mine these case reports of and for their citizens. The data can be anonymized and pooled, and we can prospectively insert questions that need to be addressed. We can correlate outcomes with presentations, with biochemical profiles, and we can better select timing of intervention, and we can address the questions that randomized trials can't. How did this particular cohort with this particular profile respond to the antihypertensive medication or to the diabetic medication? And with this amount of data available to us, I mean, becoming a center of excellence, becoming a region of excellence because of the quality of data is so available. And having that sort of data would be so attractive for leading minds to collaborate with. Next slide, please. Because so many countries today manage the same diseases differently. They investigate differently. we are not sure of the outcome in different countries, but when you drill down, you find some startling findings, as we have pointed out. The pace of change now is so fast, and we need to constantly monitor new treatments that have been instigated. We need to constantly check that pharmaceuticals live up to the promise of the trials. Of course, it will require clinicians and scientists to devise the questions and technicians to crunch the data. Next slide, please. But we are at a unique position in history, and all individual medical data is being digitized. This can be mined to answer the biggest questions that we can ask. We know that this data is valuable because multinationals are currently doing what they can to get access to this data. And of course, therein lies a whole series of future problems. Possible solutions, yes, but if this data becomes privately owned, we can see how that could be a problem. I feel that the GCC is in a powerful position now to become a United Nations of medical data, especially as gathering data in Europe has become so problematic. I know now that in certain places in Ireland, the Data Protection Act seems to prevent doctors from recording their operations, from recording videos of their surgery. And this has become a matter of interpretation for different countries. GCC countries could agree on what medical data to gather and what to share and with whom. And ultimately, the marriage of AI and big medical data is, I believe, a marriage made in cyber heaven. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Walsh. And thank you for a fascinating, thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure it will generate many questions, and look forward to receiving those for the actual question and answer session after our fourth speaker. Can I have the next slide, please? Great. So our second presenter today is Dr. Iman Tawash, Senior Lecturer in Nursing. And Iman is going to present the challenges of nursing and promoting nursing as a profession in the Arabian Gulf. The floor is yours, Dr. Iman.
Hello, this is Dr. Iman Tawash. Today I will be shedding light on the challenges of nursing and the need for promoting nursing as a profession in the Arabian Gulf. Professional nursing started with Florence Nightingale, a visionary who saw beyond the social norms of her time. In the mid-1800s, the act of nursing consisted of women taking care of family members in their homes. Nightingale saw the value of extending this role beyond the home. She had a vision that this would serve as an opportunity for both women and the profession to gain notice. So during the Crimean War, Nightingale, with a small group of nurses, joined a British military hospital. She discovered that the primary cause of fatality among wounded soldiers was from infection due to unsanitary environmental conditions. In few months, death rates dropped and countless soldiers regained health. This led to global attention to the importance of public health and infection control. These principles are relevant in the fight against today's coronavirus epidemic. Despite the challenges, today nurses have gained respect as one of the most trusted roles in society, and this is a testimony to the honesty and ethical practices nurses render. The era of Florence Nightingale is predated by the historical context of nursing in the Middle East. Like Nightingale and 12 centuries before her, Rufaida al-Aslamiyya, the first nurse in Islam, set up a school to train Muslim women. She was a promoter of community health and developed the first code of ethics. The status of women participating as nurses in the wars was highly honored by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The practice of nursing was not restricted to war times and caring for the army. Rather, there were women who used to practice nursing in times of peace. Acceptance of nursing within Islam was symbolized by nurses caring for patients in the Prophet's mosque. Unfortunately, in later years and for a long period of time, the nursing profession was badly condemned and misunderstood in the Arab region, in particular in the GCC. Within the context of health system, nurses comprise the main group of human resources for health, providing care through all national programs, often under very difficult conditions. Their contribution is recognized as essential to meeting health and development goals and delivering safe and effective care. Accessibility to and coverage of healthcare services are to a great extent dependent on nurses. Accordingly, health indicators and mortality and morbidity dynamics are directly linked to nursing practice. However, nurses face an increasing number of challenges. To recognize the critical role nurses play to enhance the global health, the World Health Organization designated 2020 as the International Year of the Nurse and the Midwife. The year 2020 marks the 200th birth anniversary of Florence Nightingale. The purpose of the International Year of the Nurse and the Midwife is to acknowledge and celebrate the contributions of nurses and midwives in achieving universal health coverage, highlight the challenges nurses and midwives face, and advocate for increased investments in the nurse and midwife workforce. Despite being recognized and valued, nurses still have to face several challenges in their profession. Challenges in nursing have existed since the beginning of the field and continue to evolve. These challenges are unique because of the level of investment nurses have in their work. The most critical issue facing healthcare systems is the shortage of people who make them work. A continued shortage of nurses is one of the major and ongoing challenges of nursing. According to WHO, to achieve the universal health coverage by the year 2030, the world will need an additional 9 million nurses and midwives. Data from 191 countries indicate a global density of around 37 nurses per 10,000 population. However, the density of nurses for the Eastern Mediterranean region is only 15.6 per 10,000 population. This has led many Arabian Gulf countries to depend on expatriate nurses to meet the healthcare needs of their populations. The expatriate nursing workforce in some Arab countries may be over 80%. This situation deprives these countries of a sustainable national capacity, an issue which will have to be addressed in the long run. Staff shortages are associated with significant decreases in general quality of patient care, increases in the length of patient stays within hospitals, and greater number of hospital-acquired patient illnesses. In most countries of the region, there is a shortage of male nurses as well, and more efforts are needed to develop a gender-balanced nursing workforce. Nursing shortages has been attributed to numerous factors, including increased population growth, aging population, where increased life expectancy is accompanied by increased numbers of chronically and critically ill patients. Like the populations they serve, the nursing workforce is also aging. Nursing turnover is a major issue impacting the performance and profitability of healthcare organizations. Healthcare organizations require a stable, highly trained and fully engaged nursing staff. Yet, a growing shortage of qualified nurses has led to a steady increase in the turnover rate among nurses. This turnover rate is likely to become even worse over the coming years as the growth of the healthcare industry continues to outstrip the available supply of nurses. Nurses' turnover creates staffing shortages that increase the work demands placed on the remaining nurses. This heightens the risk of the remaining nurses quitting due to excess workload and burnout. The result is a vicious cycle of constantly increasing nurse turnover. Adding to the shortage problem is that nursing is still majority females. As working mothers, nurses are struggling to find safe, accessible, and affordable childcare facilities to their children. And so they are forced to choose between their career and family. The themes related to poor working conditions were attributed to work-related factors such as long working hours and rotating shifts, low pay, and exposure to hazards. Long hours have been one of many consistent challenges in nursing. With the current shortage in nursing, hospital nurses are usually working long hours with extra load of patients. Nurses typically have demanding schedules because nursing is a 24/7 round-the-clock job. The job of a nurse requires an individual to have great strength of mind along with having a gentle attitude towards the patients. This type of work increases the risk of fatigue and stress that could lead to medical errors. Compounded by increased workload is low pay and lack of financial incentives. Nurses' concerns about the lack of recognition and appreciation seem to have generated frustration and disappointment, which adversely influence the nurses' work satisfaction and hence their retention. Nurses are always at risk of being exposed to various diseases that their patients have. This is especially evident with today's COVID-19 virus. Nurses are also exposed to injuries and are constantly exposed to hazardous chemicals and materials that can be harmful for their health. Technological advancements have also impacted the healthcare profession in a positive and exciting ways and led to overall improved population health. But technology also has created one of the newest challenges of nursing. Technology moves at a very fast pace, and new advances can have an immediate impact on the way nurses work, requiring nurses to continually learn new skills. Added to an already heavy workload, dealing with new software or new equipment can seem overwhelming. Support system policies continue to represent areas which need to be further developed. Type of support systems range from encouragement and motivation offered by the family to appreciation, recognition, and supportive policies practiced by the employing institutions. National regulations and organizational policies addressing nurses' concerns were highlighted in several studies as important factors to overcome challenges facing nursing recruitment and retention. In order to retain qualified nurses in a competitive labor market, hospitals need to develop personnel policies and benefits, which should include lifelong professional development, opportunities for career advancement, flexible scheduling, competitive salaries, and improved work climate and workforce management. More work is also needed in the area of strengthening regulations, the development of nursing leadership, and national strategic plans. The public image of the nurse appears to be negative in countries where strong cultural traditions severely restrict the participation of women in paid occupations outside their homes. Females experience social pressure associated with working in socially unacceptable mixed gender settings and having to cover long hours of unfavorable night and weekend duties. Lack of public awareness about nursing refers to a number of factors, including a lack of career counseling and advisory services at schools, inadequate marketing interventions on the part of academic institutions, and poorly represented media coverage on nursing and nurses. Lack of awareness on nursing coupled with the lack of family support explain lack of an interest in nursing as a career choice. A major challenge to nursing education is the low admission rates, which is linked to the poor local image and lack of awareness of nursing. A key problem is the slow development of undergraduate and postgraduate nursing education to match the growing needs of the population and national and international standards for providing quality healthcare services. Patients' needs and healthcare environments have become more complex, and nurses need to achieve a higher level of skills, competencies, and attitudes to meet these needs with efficiency, quality, and safety. There is a need to develop a strategic approach to upskilling the profession through specialization in nursing. Nursing specialists bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise to patient care and can improve patient care outcomes. Nursing faculty are experiencing a shortage as well, which leads to limiting the number of nurses that a school or a nursing school can generate. Other challenges include the need to strengthen collaboration between nursing education and nursing services to strengthen clinical learning and improve students' preparedness for nursing services needs. Finally, programs are needed to provide refresher training to older nurses returning to the workforce after raising a family. While the region continues to invest in the development of nursing resources as a critical component of the health system and health services development, several gaps remain in the provision of well-trained and motivated health workforces as a whole, and in nursing in particular. Promoting nursing in the society can be achieved simply by overcoming its challenges. The Nursing Positive Recruitment Arabic Model is an initiative from Bahrain that I wish to share with you. It aims to provide guidance and creative strategies to promote nursing in the Arab world. This best practice model emerged from the notion that successful nursing recruitment strategies cannot function in isolation of the historical misperceptions of nursing, the Arab people's cultural background, and local policies. The model builds on international recruitment strategies with a guiding principle that international nursing recruitment models cannot be simply imported into the Arab world. The Nurse Pram, the model is built on 5 imposing pillars for nursing promotion and sets out strategies which build on the positive aspects of nursing and career guidance. So enhancing nursing recruitment will require a review of the impact and of government policies on the availability of scholarships, job vacancies, salaries, and clear processes for career structure, as well as improving the status of nursing and the working conditions of nurses. Then comes the positive. The provision of a structured nursing career guidance systems in high school is essential. The role of Arabic nursing alumni and senior nursing students must be developed in collaboration between high schools and the schools of nursing. Recruitment is employing effective strategies to promote nursing in the community, which is essential to improve the knowledge and awareness of nursing as a career. Given the influence parents and family have on career decisions, the involvement of students' parents is key to the promotion of nursing as a professional career. Considering the Arabic culture, policymakers need to assess the implementation of new and more creative scheduling schemes to attract more local people. identifying role models who are respected and admired by young people and from whom they can take a lead is significantly important to the establishment of a productive national nursing recruitment strategy. And the model, in the recruitment context of a recruitment model, must encompass and accommodate diverse perspectives which directly influence young persons' choice of nursing as a career, including parents, nurses as role models, and media to reflect more positive portrayals of nurses. In conclusion, improving the profession of nursing and overcoming the challenges faced by nurses improves healthcare for all. Tremendous progress has been achieved in nursing development, both at the national and regional levels. However, if health system performance is to be improved and progress towards meeting the development goals accelerated, urgent action is needed to overcome the problems that seriously undermine the contribution of nursing services. A strong nursing profession is central to the future development of health services in the Middle East, with less reliance on expatriate nurses and an increase in local nurses. There's growing evidence of the impact of low nursing staffing levels on the quality of patient care. Thus, sustaining a nursing workforce is fundamental to healthcare systems and the quality of patient care. However, this depends largely on the availability and the ability to recruit more nurses. The global strategic directions for nursing and midwifery services outlined 5 key areas in the nursing and midwifery sector where urgent attention is required. These include human resources planning and capacity building, management of personnel, evidence-based practice, education, and stewardship. Thank you for listening.
So turning now to our fourth and final presenter, it's my pleasure to be able to present to you Professor Manaf Al-Qahtani, Professor of Medicine and Microbiology at the School of Medicine, Rcsi, Bahrain. So Professor Manaf, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is Manaf Al-Qahtani. I am a professor of medicine at Rcsi. My background is an infectious disease and clinical microbiologist. I'm a member of the National Task Force team and the chairman of the COVID-19 control room in Bahrain. I have 20 minutes where I'm gonna really engage you in a very important and hot topic these days, which would be the effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccination in the Kingdom of Bahrain from the real life perspective. Just a little background before I start with my slides. You're all aware that there has been several trials has been conducted worldwide. Bahrain was among those phase 3 clinical trial where we have tested the efficacy of the vaccine. And this is where I wanted to make the clear distinction between efficacy and effectiveness. Most of the trials, they focus on efficacy of the intervention because it's really been conducted in a very controlled environment. There are a set of rules that the investigators are following, providing certain care for their volunteers. And this is very important because without those data, you will not be able to authorize the intervention. What we have learned, and I think this is quite true for any other intervention, not only the vaccine, is that when you implement it in the real life, things really are quite differently. You have a bigger population size, you have a more heterogeneous, here where all this co-founding things are gonna intervene, and the reality is that that sometimes we tend to really focus on just the efficacy, and we really forget about that the most important thing would be also the effectiveness of this intervention. And this is where really I wanted to share with you here. Yet, as you know, we just started the rollout vaccination December 16, but even before that, we started the EUA way before November of 2020, where we have given all the frontliners the COVID-19 vaccination. And at that time, we focused on the inactivated serocell or the Cuneiform vaccine. Now, since December, since this is the actual national vaccination program, we actually started to collect all the data for those who get the vaccine in terms of we looked at that at 2 angles. First of all, how many of those who got the vaccine, regardless of the number of the doses, got COVID-19? And if they got COVID-19, what sort of clinical manifestation do they have? Are they more symptomatic versus asymptomatic? And how many of those who get COVID-19, they needed to be in a hospital? And if those who needed to be in a hospital, where do they land on? Do they go to more of mild facility? And I'm going to just really define them. In Bahrain, we have 3 categories of admission. I have to say actually 4 categories. The first one is we have facilities that can take up to 4,000 beds for asymptomatic to mild symptomatic. Now, why do I admit asymptomatic at this days? Because some of the people, they don't have a suitable home environment where we really needed to kind of host them during their infectivity period. So, and this is where we have the majority of the beds. Then we have the moderate cases healthcare facility. Again, those who are started to be more symptomatic and they require to be at a certain requirement for oxygenation, and we have different level of oxygenations. And then we have the severe critical cases. So the severe critical cases, they are linked to an ICU, so it's an ICU facility. So we have around 326 ICU fully equipped here in the kingdom, just dedicated for COVID-19. And those will be for those who require to be on non-invasive mechanical ventilation or on a high flow oxygenation, or if needed to be intubated, or if they're really very sick and they are on inotropic support. So this is where we have looked at all the variables, if I can call it or label it, in terms of post COVID-19 vaccination. The other important element we have looked at is the percentage of those who are who've got the COVID and they are vaccinated. What's the percentage of those they transmit, even if they are asymptomatic, of the virus to their close contact? And again, we really had great results among those population. And of course, the third element was the safety. Have we seen any other side effects of the vaccine in the real situation? I mean, let's say the red flag side effect. So this is where I'm going to really take you through the next few slides when we talk about the real effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccination among COVID-19 vaccinated population. All right. So this is what we have done. Again, this is not a completed set of data. We're still working on it. I have to say, I have recorded this on March 17th. So we are still working on finalizing all the data, but this is what I've really got. And again, it really reflects some hope when it comes for vaccines. So we have looked at over 65,812 contacts that we've been tracing from the contact tracing people from January till February 2021. Among those who are labeled to be positive based on the national Bahrain national protocol result interpretation. So we've got 14,000 out of the 65. So this is around 22.48%. Now we have then went into more details, and we have looked at those 14,000 population. How many of those got vaccinated, regardless now the number of doses? And again, we are still working on those who received the full immunity, like the 2 doses, completed the 2 weeks. But this is just really a very basic looking at regardless the number. And again, we wanted to test even the efficacy, whether you receive 1 dose or 2 doses, to see whether this would protect you from acquiring the virus, from transmitting the virus, etc. So this is where we have done it. So we have allocated 8,414 among the vaccinated, but at the same time, from the same cohort group, we have looked at a matched control group that from the contact, but they have not get vaccinated, and they got the COVID-19 as well. And again, we have really taken age in consideration, gender in consideration as well, and the nationality. So we've got 8,414. This is the vaccinated, and we discover among those who are vaccinated only 1,102 positive with COVID-19. So that gives you 13.1%. Acquired the infection. The good news, we did not have any mortalities among those population. When you looked at the cohort, the control group, same as I say, matched the group to the best that we could do at the time I'm presenting this. We found that there has been over 2,200 positive cases in an unvaccinated contact group, and unfortunately we had 2 deaths. So we have 13.1% acquired infection from the vaccinated contact versus 26.7% who acquired the infection in the non-vaccinated contact with 2 mortality. So we can say in those cohorts, so we have around 51% reduction of acquisition of the infection in the vaccinated group, and this is a very encouraging numbers. Now, I want people to be very clear here is that when you want to look at the efficacy, of course, that has been more than 45,000, at least from the Bahrain trial population, you'll get different percentages. The whole idea here is you really wanted to test the efficacy on the trial on the effectiveness in the real life. And I think 51% is a quite good number. And I don't have the statistical analysis, but they're all has been statistically significant as well. And then we looked at the type of the vaccine. As you all recall, Bahrain, and again, if I'm not mistaken, I think Bahrain considered to be the first and the only country until this date that provided 4 different platforms. The 5th one is going to come in the few weeks, but we have until now we have 4 different platforms to provide our population with COVID-19 vaccines. So we have the inactivated, the traditional one. This is the Sinopharm vaccine. We have the messenger mRNA, that's the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and we have the vector-based AstraZeneca cough shield vaccination, and we have also the vector-based Sputnik vaccination. So those have been really looked at, but the majority, over 70% of the Bahrain population has been really took the Sinopharm vaccines, and I think we might really needed more data for Sputnik and cough shield, and also with the Pfizer to really have a good solid background to compare them. But this is, as I say, very rough kind of estimate. It really clearly tells you when you looked at the percentage of infection versus non-infection in different vaccine group, the golden color is indicating that you're not infected, whereas the dark blue navy color indicated that this is the infective. And you can see, and you look at the numbers or the percentage. So I have 13% got infected regardless of the number of the dose. from the Sinopharm, looking at from 87% from the same population that did not get infected from COVID-19. Again, Pfizer look at 9%. But again, the population are much less than Sinopharm. And if you look at the Cough Shield and the Sputnik, again, you will see that the percentage of acquiring infection in those people, again, regardless of the number of the dose, it's not very significant. And again, this is a very positive findings that really encourage us to continue following up all the vaccinated group. And this is what we are intending to continue doing. On the third slide, so remember the other sector that we wanted to look at. Okay, you've been diagnosed with COVID despite you being vaccinated. We want to see your clinical manifestation and where do you end up. Now, the clinical presentation I did not put in this slide because I did not really have the time to finish it up. But the majority of those cases were symptomatic among the vaccinated group. But I just want to remind you, more than 80% of our daily positive case in the Kingdom of Bahrain by now are the B117. The B117, it's the new variant virus, has been first discovered in the UK, and it's now become the most dominant. So I can say with the confidence that the most dominant strain in Bahrain now, it's the B117. We have looked at the Brazilian and the South African, and we just really had 1 or 2 cases, and unfortunately there was no mortality associated with them. So having said that, and I think this is a very crucial things to kind of pose at the moment. So remember, we have done most of the vaccine trials without including the variant, at least to our best knowledge. We really didn't went back, but the data says the first discovery was from September when they discovered the B117. But having said that, you have the new variant, testing them in the real life, and even with those, you really see some encouraging result. Like remember, people were worried about, this might have some escape immune response when you have the new variant. But as I say, this is very encouraging result so far. So let's just look at those who have been admitted and compare those who have been vaccinated in comparison to no vaccine. And again, this would be a collective from all the vaccine platform that we have. So we have only 8% of those who have been vaccinated and got COVID that needed to be in hospital. The good news, they really needed hospitalization only for observation or because they have mild symptoms. Now, we had 4 cases only so far until this date. We have only 4 cases who they've been admitted to the moderate case facility. You're talking about 4 cases out of 300,000 of cases that has been vaccinated. So you've got this number, 8% been admitted to a facility for observation, and 92% they did not require to be admitted. Again, this is very encouraging. If I just focus on the same group, the vaccinated, and I look at the age-wise, of course, people would know, even from previous influenza vaccine, that the inactivated tend to have less immune production, or let's say immune response, for those who are above a certain age group, specifically if you are above age of 60 and above, 65 and above. But even when you look at that, and if I look at the different age group, how many of those needed to be admitted? Again, my main high risk group here would be in the Bahrain are those who are above 50 and above. And again, we have really chosen the 50, not because 50 are old, but would be very easy for us to capture the the bigger population. So if you go at those who are above 50, you've got only 44 who needed to be admitted versus 285. Again, this is quite reassuring. And again, if you go to 40 to 49, only 16. And if you go to 30 to 39, you have a 23. Now, among of those 30 to 39, those who had morbid obesity, I'm talking about BMI of 30. So things we have learned that if you are morbid obese, and if you are age above I'm going to just focus here on Bahrain, 50, you tend to be at higher risk for complication. And this is what we have looked at so far from the Bahraini data. When you look at the non-vaccinated group, there has been 11%. So 126 needed to be admitted versus 91 in the vaccinated group, and 89% did not require to be admitted. And again, we looked at the different ages, and as you can tell, those who are above 50, we had more people needed to be admitted, 60 versus 44. And again, those people actually who occupy the bed for a longer time, those people who tend to be much sick. But fortunately, with the vaccinated group, the majority, I'm not going to say all of them, they had mild symptoms. This slide, again, this is really not updated. This is where we have looked at the spread protection, if I may say it. Again, at that time, before we do the first slide that I have shared with you, initially we've been looking at all infected cases that acquired. The first slide I talked about the contact group, but here I focus on individual that they actually got the COVID-19 themselves. So we have looked at almost 451, and this data from until March the 1st, if I remember correctly. So the 456 individual had a total of 1,591 close contact, and the contact of the non-vaccinated group of the same sample size in the same time period when they looked at, they had almost 1,768, and I think this is purely due to some behavioral differences. So 217 contact of the vaccinated group tested positive. So this is again 13.6%. And when you looked at the other cohort from the 1,768, we found 418 tested positive, so this is a 24%. So an overall reduction would be a 42.4%. And again, looking at only those population, the majority of the people had actually by gene sequencing. They had the drop as first, and then we did the gene sequencing, and they had the UKB 117, which is the what we call it as the UK variant. Now, the last slide I'll be talking about is actually how to categorize the high risk of people in Bahrain, and how do we test the efficacy, the effectiveness of the vaccine among those high risk. In Bahrain, we have the morbid obesity and those who are above age of 50, they tend to be the higher risk. This is the one that we have seen them and ended up in the ICU, needed mechanical ventilation. In this slide, I focus on the age only, did not have the full analysis for the morbid obesity. Still some work need to be placed, but again, this is some preliminary data, I should say, very promising as well. Has been sent to the Center for Statistical Analysis. I just received the good news that all of it were statistically significant. But again, here I looked at two just vaccine platforms in those who are above age of 50. Again, the rationale from this, I just want to make sure, knowing the fact that from the inactivated vaccine experience that we have from the flu vaccine, for example, the elderly people tend to produce less protection from inactivated. And this is where people they wonder when they talk about I got the flu shot and I get the flu again. Again, it will not be 100%, and even if you get the flu, it will be very mild. So we are testing the same hypothesis with the coronavirus on those population, looking at two different platforms, the messenger and inactivated. So we have 839 cases who are above above the age of 50. And one thing very crucial, I really forgot to say it, that during the month of February and January of this year, our mortality, unfortunately, made up more than 90% out of those who are above the age of 50. And I think this is very important. So here we really wanted to see, could the vaccine save some lives? So we have a population size of 839. Again, those who have been vaccinated and infected with the virus, regardless the number of the dose. So how many of those actually went into a home isolation? So majority, 82%, went to a home isolation, and only 17.2% needed admission. And of those who, the 17.2%, which is the 137 out of the 839 population, we had 33% ended up into the mild care facility. The facility I have defined the eligibility for admission, versus 51% needed to be in a moderate, and only 16% needed to be in ICU or severe cases healthcare facility. And we had only 13 out of 800, 1.3% death among those. Again, this is regardless number of the dose. We know that to have a full response of immunity, you need the 2 doses, and you need at least to pass the 2 weeks of those interval post the vaccine. But we have also looked at some matched non-vaccinated group, again, same size, matched to the gender and population, and we have looked at similar size number 839, and out of those 22 deaths. So we have 13 people died here, and we have 22 deaths, so 2.5%. And of those who are infected, we have 87% ended up in a home isolation, and only 12%, 12.6% actually need admission. So here you're going to see some differences, right? So you're going to look up why you have more people who've been vaccinated ended up admitted. Again, the idea from those who got the vaccine and they are tested positive, for those who are above 50, even if you don't have symptoms, but you have the risk factor, namely the age, and also if they are morbid obese, or if they have some chronic illness, we tend to admit them electively just to look at their course of illness. We have done the same thing we have done back in February 2020, where we have admitted every single patient. And the reason we admitted every single patient, because at that time we really have limited information about the behavior of this virus and when the people would deteriorate. So we really wanted to make sure when they deteriorate, they deteriorate within the healthcare facility. So we did the same thing for the vaccine, and we admitted them just to look after them and to see how many of those. And this is where you see the differences between the two group among the Sinopharm vaccine group. If you looked at the messenger mRNA, so that's the Pfizer. So again, we had at that time only very small people got the infected, 54. Remember, so far, we have roughly around 90,000 people who received at least one single shot of messenger mRNA, versus Sinopharm, whom you have now over 400,000 people who received at least a single shot. So you can see there's really big sample size differences. But again, if you look at those messenger mRNA, there was no death in this group. Majority, 92%, ended up in the home isolation, and 11% needed admission. But again, none of them actually needed to be in ICU. Only 3 out of the 6 needed to be in moderate, and 3 in the mild. If you looked at their comparative group, we had 5 deaths. Again, we looked at 54 here, so we have 5 deaths here. And if you want to look, if you want to compare even the admission, even here we have 13%, so 7 people. Here we have 6 people. Again, I haven't done if this is really going to be statistically significant. It could be not, but the really only 7 out in comparison to 6 with the vaccinated that needed to be admitted. But again, we had 5 people here needed to be in ICU. We have 0 people here needed to be in ICU. Overall, when you look at the combined effect, so things clearly says that if you get COVID, even post the vaccine, and you are above 50, the chance you're going to end up in home isolation is much higher. The chance you're going to have mild symptoms or no symptoms will be much higher, and the chances of ended up if you admitted into ICU would be much less in comparison to the non-vaccinated group, and the death again would be certainly much higher in non-vaccinated. So the bottom line, and I think this is going to be the last slide of my presentation, is that this is some promising data, needed to have more. Again, this is more promising preliminary data, I have to say. Needed more work to be done, and this is what we are doing right now. We are really putting our investment on the vaccine, on the vaccinated group. Certainly, when we have different platforms, I think we're going to really have a very powerful data that we can share with the scientific community in terms of the effectiveness of the vaccine, a different age group as well. And with that, I would like to conclude, and thank you very much. And I think if there are any questions, we'll be happy to take them towards the end. And please stay well and safe as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Manaf, for that really very excellent presentation, state of the art of where we are in Bahrain. And I'm sure it's a huge interest to everyone who is attending this conference at this precise moment. We're now going into the question and answer session. We're running a little late, but I think we should be doing the full 15 minutes as we have on the actual program. And so what I'm going to do is, if all the presenters could perhaps, I don't know if it's possible to have their cameras on, but if not, what we're going to do is we're going to start with Professor Walsh. There's a question that's come in. There's a question that's come in, Tom, which is, how is it possible to access data in private health sector in GCC countries? Do you have any idea about that?
The answer is no. But as I was developing this theme, I was, the more I thought about it, the more that, that the time has come to put it out there to the health managers to say, this data, it's the first time we've had access to data like this. It's the first time we've had an opportunity. The data currently resides, in archives. There's a sump of data. It makes no sense not to try and access it for everybody's benefit, for the health funders, health managers. Certainly, my understanding is that the Googles of this world are desperately trying to get their hands on it, and so that's not for no good reason. Let's put it like that. So I think that I would think that most people who control this sort of data haven't given it sufficient thought yet. But I think that now is the time, and I thought that by provoking this discussion, now I've had a discussion with a few individuals who are in position of authority, whom I won't name, but we've explored how this might happen or why it mightn't happen, but we are at a crossroads, and there are people who can either drive this forward or not.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So turning to Iman, a question's come in. Do you think that COVID has been beneficial for the nursing profession?
Thank you, Professor Stephen.
Yes, on one side of the, the whole crisis, I think it has been beneficial to show the successful stories of nurses and to reflect how important they are in keeping, the healthcare services running and in helping with saving lives, patients' lives, and with educating, the whole community about the importance of taking precautions to prevent the spread of the disease. But definitely on the other side, COVID-19 have added more into the workload and pressure on nurses because first because of the shortages and then the effects of COVID-19. A lot of nurses have died, like many other healthcare workers as well. When they are in contact with the disease, then they will definitely need to be, isolated, and that adds up even to the shortages of nurses practicing in the hospital. So this is the COVID-19 effects.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Turning now to Nigel, do you think that this mechanism of degrading proteins is used by other viruses to block the response to interferon?
That's an interesting question, Steve. Yeah, we've done additional bioinformatic analysis on all the viral genomes that we could find, and we have identified a lot of viruses containing these elongin C and cullen binding sites. And some of them are really interesting viruses in relation to needing treatment and needing vaccines. We've identified them in Zika, we've found them in Ebola, and we've also found them in dengue. So those are major viruses that really there are no therapies for at the moment, and it would be useful to expand our research. So yeah, I have my lifelong career planned out looking at all these viruses.
Thank you very much indeed, Nigel. Manaf, there's a question come in here. Do we have data showing the number or percentage of frontline healthcare workers vaccinated and the number of infected cases and the mortality rate among them?
Right, so in Bahrain, we have reached 64% of the healthcare worker has been vaccinated, and it's around 12% of those healthcare workers as an overall get infected.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Tom, turning to you, there's a question here on a slightly off topic, open access. And you mentioned about, I think, because of the importance of case reports, do you think that open access publishing and having to pay has decreased the number of case reports and therefore the available data?
I think I would be more concerned that obviously, I think some journals have made this into an industry, and I think that the sort of the bigger, more prestigious journals have relegated, clinical observations and clinical material, individual clinical material like that. It's been relegated and is no longer considered as important. One of the editorial board of one of the journals said that recently the British Journal of Surgery, for instance, are probably going to go along with the major journals and say they won't accept trials from single institutions anymore. They have to be multi-institutional. I think, I reflect on some of the great advances in surgery, and I suppose surgery is my discipline. And when I think of where some of the great advances came from some small institutions, and when thinking of the esophagus, like the Ivor Lewis operation came from Chester, the three-stage esophagectomy came from Darlington, the TME, total mesorectal excision, came from Basingstoke. These didn't come from the major centres of excellence. They came from people with an idea in out-of-the-way centres, and perhaps were able to develop their idea because they weren't encumbered by big business or big, institutions. You know, I just think that an idea can flicker and flame up anywhere, and you know, just because it hasn't a multi-institutional background support doesn't mean it isn't valuable, you know. But you know.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Turning to Iman, there's a question here. You mentioned policies to be created to protect nurses. I am just curious, is the safe staffing ratio or legislate applied in governmental hospitals in Bahrain?
So, Stephen, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Sure. You mentioned policies to be created to protect nurses. I am just curious, is the safe staffing ratio or legislature applied in governmental hospitals in Bahrain? So I think it's just that, is safe staffing ratio applied in the hospitals, the governmental hospitals in Bahrain?
Yes, thank you. In fact, the ratio of patient to staff nurses has always been less than the norm, the international standards, and this applies to all, I think, majority of the hospital. What is helping private hospitals, especially here in Bahrain, is that the number of patients itself is much lesser than the government hospitals, but definitely there is huge shortages of nurses in governmental hospitals. You can imagine sometimes ratios in some wards of 8 to 1 staff nurse, or sometimes more, regardless of the health status of these patients. In some medical wards, for example, there are critically ill patients in these medical wards, yet they still are being cared of by the same numbers of nurses who take care of all the other patients.
Thanks for the lecture, great. Thank you very much indeed. Nigel, the SOX proteins are very important in diabetes, and you showed the SOX protein of importance in viral kind of replication and effects. Do you think that those patients with diabetes get worse infection as a consequence?
That's a brilliant question, Steve. Yeah, so we've actually seen that a number of viruses induce SOX proteins, and I didn't fully explain SOX proteins in my talk, but they are suppressors of cytokine signaling. So they're induced by lots of cytokines like TNF, IL-6, and interferon that we're looking at. And yeah, we're interested in exploring that to look and see, because SOX proteins actually regulate insulin signaling as well. So if viruses induce SOX, then could those SOX that are induced by the infection actually inhibit insulin signaling and cause insulin resistance? So yeah, you're right. We're hoping to start those sort of experiments in that project here in Bahrain over the next few months to investigate that.
Manaf, there's been a rash of questions. They're on a common theme. The first kind of theme is, if we get to 80% of vaccination, will we achieve herd immunity with this virus, or do we need a much higher percentage? And the other corollary to that is, do we need to have a number of vaccines? So if you had Sinopharm, do you now need a booster, for example, Pfizer or AstraZeneca?
Right. So before the new variant, or the variant of concerns, our target was actually, if we reach 50% of immunization or the herd immunity, that should be enough. We did that based on the R0 at that time, which was only 1.5, and we did the calculation based on the Bahrain size, taking off those who've been recovered. So this is how we came up with the 50%. In the US, they targeted around 70 to 75% to reach their herd immunity. We, as I said, we really need to be quite humble with this virus. I keep saying this. There's so many things that we learn about this virus, and certainly when it comes with the new variant. So remember when I said it's 85%, they are just B117. We still have the remaining 15%. It's the variant of concern as well. We don't know whether they are of concern or not, but it's not the original wild type of virus. It keeps mutating. The more you vaccinate the people faster, the more you're going to reduce the chance of having a new variant or more mutations. So I think I would be more than happy if we reach 50% at this stage. Now in Bahrain, we are reaching around 46%, regardless of the number of the dose of the targeted population. The good news, 85% are those who are above age 50, so we have reached that target. Now the problem is that we're facing with the younger generation, so especially those who are less than 19 and those between 30 and 40. This is the mobile vector for carrying the virus. And this is where we have planning to change now our recommendations in terms of preventing the spread of this virus. I forgot the next part of the question.
Is there a place for combining the different vaccines? Yeah.
Right. So for the inactivated, yes, I think booster dose will be there. And again, I just want to clarify things. When we talk about inactivated, it's a very normal to have a booster dose. Usually it's 12 months, so in a year. With this virus, whether it's going to be 6 months or more, I think we still need more data. But certainly in Bahrain, especially in those who are above 50, we do require the booster dose. We see some enhancement of the immune production. And usually we have been doing this 6 months after receiving the second dose. And we just start doing this just lately. But to make it universal, you have to think of the vaccine supply. You need to first vaccinate as much as you can. I do believe a single shot at this moment will not be good enough to have antibody production, but it's better than nothing. So the more you vaccinate, Steve, at this stage, the more you reduce the chance of the viral replication, and therefore the more chance you reduce the chance of having a new variant. And I think this is the biggest concern worldwide. You're seeing now, even in the US and the UK, the numbers are just staggering around at a level. More death are also encountering. So the message is clear: get vaccinated with any type of vaccine that you have.
Thank you. We are running out of time, but there's still a rash of questions here. So could I each ask you another question in turn, but with a brief answer, please, because of the time constraints. So Tom, there's a question here on basically, do you think that these systematic reviews and meta-analysis get it wrong or lead to complacency?
Yes, I think that you've got to look very, very carefully at the study before you include it in your meta-analysis. I think there's a sort of people, I think, read the abstract without reading the actual methodology in detail, which would preclude many of what passes for a good randomized trial.
Thank you. Iman, there's a question here. Is there a particular lack of specialist nurses in the GCC due to training opportunities?
Unfortunately, here, whether in Bahrain or the GCC, there is a lack of, specialist nurses training, and as well as, there is no maybe understanding of the importance of having specialized nurses working in different healthcare fields. And this is why we don't have training, because training is mainly based on hospital needs or healthcare services needs.
Thank you very much. Nigel, this is a question I'm not really quite sure if you're going to be able to answer very briefly, but is there a role of these heat shock proteins, which also work through the kind of E3 ligase complex and cause protein ubiquination?
So there are about 1,000 different E3 ligases, and so the one we look at contains elongin C, elongin B, culin, and RBX proteins, and that forms, and then we believe that the virus then promotes that formation. Absolutely possible that heat shock proteins are also involved. and it would be fascinating to explore this. They have been shown to be involved in some E3 ligases, and we know that they're produced when you get a viral infection, and we know that hepatitis C infects the liver, and they're produced from the liver. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a link.
And thank you very much indeed. And Manaf, again, put you on the spot here. I mean, there's been an awful lot of questions come in, but do you have a preferred vaccine yourself? Are all created equal?
No. That's the shortest answer, right? No, I don't have.
Okay, thank you all very much indeed. It's been a fantastic session. All the presentations have been so instructive, thought-provoking, and truly in the spirit of Rcsi Bahrain. And I thank you very much indeed. You should all deserve a very good round of applause that I can't actually give you, unfortunately, because it's virtual. So once again, thank you so much for your time and all the effort that you've put into this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we're on to the research abstracts overview, which will be the next. And of that, what we've actually got, we received 62 abstracts in total, of which the conference committee managed to score and select 6 for oral presentations. All of the abstracts were really high quality. And what we're going to do is put all the abstracts on the Rcsi site so that people can see them. And all people who put an abstract in will get a letter of a commendation for putting the effort in. However, we did select the 6 for oral presentations, and therefore I'm going to ask, this is an alphabetical order. The first presentation is going to be Dr. Ashan Luang-Luava, and that is going to be on the functional impact of beta-clothogene activated collagen scaffold on stem cells driven soft tissue healing. I would say to all the presenters, you have 7 minutes to present with 3 minutes for questions at the end. I'd be grateful if you could try and stick to time. So Ashan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Steve. Good morning, everyone. I'll take a small detour away from the COVID and talk about my work. That is the functional impact of beta-clothogene activated collagen scaffold on stem cell-driven wound healing, soft tissue healing. So the first thing is a brief introduction about the protein clotho. It was first discovered by a group of Japanese scientists in the year 1997. They found that the gene was involved in the aging process, and normally this gene or the protein is expressed transmembranously on the cells, and they kind of share a similar homology to type 1 glycosidases family. So in the study, they found that the animals lacking this gene showed a very severe organ failure as well as significantly reduced lifespan. In the picture here, we can clearly see the mutant mice, that is a clotho deficient mice, is very underdeveloped. However, the group further showed that exogenous delivery of the clotho gene can rescue the mice from undergoing this abnormal development. With this, there has been about 3 different types of clothos discovered so far, and I'll be focusing more about the beta clotho that is highly expressed in the adipose tissue. So we have our research interest currently in the application of stem cells and gene-activated scaffolds for wound healing, and we have made some publications recently. In particular, we want to use stem cells derived from the adipose tissue because the stem cells can be harvested using a minimally invasive manner called liposuction, and the yield could be as high as 500 times than the conventionally used bone marrow stem cells. And we have recently published this work, using this human adipose-derived stem cells and the gene-activated scaffold targeting diabetic wound healing applications. So our brief experimental setup is first using a polyplex nanoparticle that contains the gene and soak loading into a freeze-dried, a very optimized in our tissue engineering research group lab in Dublin, a collagen chondroitin sulfate scaffold. We soak load it, and then we produce the gene-activated scaffold. In the second step, we use this gene-activated scaffold and seeded them with human adipose-derived stem cells, and we assess their functional response for over 2 weeks' time. So the first thing is studying if the stem cells can pick up the genes from the gene-activated scaffold, and we use a conventional PCR technique, and we confirm that the stem cells were able to pick up these genes and express about 170-fold by day 3, and shows a very transient manner of expression. So the key finding here is that the gene-activated scaffold is able to induce transient overexpression of the beta-gluto gene for up to 14 days. So having seen this, we wanted to determine the various stem cell features essential for promoting wound repair after the overexpression. The first thing is the stemness. Second is how good they proliferate within the gene-activated scaffold. Third is how good they control the wound healing regulators like the TGF-beta1 and TGF-beta3. Fourth is how good they are able to control neighboring cells like the endothelial cells and fibroblasts in terms of matrix deposition. Fifth is within the gene-activated scaffold, how good the stem cells deposit matrix, and as well as what kind of proteins they express with regards to improved qualitative healing. So the first thing is we assess for stem cell pluripotency markers, and these are the trial that is normally used to develop induced pluripotent stem cells, and we can clearly see a significant increase in OCT4 compared to the other two transcription factors. And the stem cells within the gene-activated scaffold also proliferated well, as confirmed by the expression of the proliferation marker Ki67. Very interestingly, what we noted was the stem cells were able to produce an anti-fibrotic response in a very early time point through the expression of TGF-beta3. So the key findings here is the gene-activated scaffold supports the ADAC's proliferation, and it also is able to prolong the stemness of the stem cells by significant increase in OCT4 expression. It also promotes the early activation of anti-fibrotic factor TGF-beta3. The second thing that we studied is how good the stem cells on the gene-activated scaffold controls neighboring cells. So we use a technique called the Paracrine bioactivity study, in which we collect the medium from the stem cells and we expose it to cell types, the other cell types like the endothelial cells that produces blood vessels and the skin fibroblast cells. So the first thing is the pro-angiogenic paracrine activity, and we learned that the medium produced by the stem cells from the gene-activated scaffold were able to significantly enhance the capillary-like network formation of the endothelial cells. And this process was sustained for up to 14 days. So the key finding here is a significant enhancement of the paracrine pro-angiogenic activity of the stem cells in the gene-activated scaffold. And the second is that the angiogenesis or the activity is temporally controlled. The second thing is studying how these cells, the stem cells, are able to modulate, the fibroblast matrix remodeling, which is essential for wound repair. So these are the two main proteins produced by fibroblasts, the collagen 1 being pro-fibrotic and the collagen 3 being anti-fibrotic. And these are produced by normal fibroblast that is exposed to stem cells medium on the gene-free scaffold. When we have it on the when we have the medium from the gene-activated scaffold, they were able to significantly control the production of collagen 1 in the fibroblast. However, it did not have a significant change or a drastic change in terms of the production of collagen 3. So the key finding here is the stem cells on the gene-activated scaffold offers a significant paracrine control over pro-fibrotic collagen 1 expression in human endodermal fibroblast. Ultimately, we assessed for the deposition of matrix proteins by the stem cells on the gene-activated scaffold. So these proteins are typically the alpha-smooth muscle actin, which is associated with wound contraction and scar. Then the basement membrane proteins essential for regeneration of the tissue, and as well as the elastic protein, elastin, for structural mechanical stability. So in the gene-activated scaffold, the stem cells showed a very significantly reduced expression of the alpha-smooth muscle actin. It didn't have a significant effect on the deposition of fibronectin. However, it tremendously increased the deposition of basement membrane protein collagen 4 by about 8.8-fold. And also, deposited a relatively mature fibrous network of elastin. From this, the key findings are that the gene-activated scaffold is able to significantly reduce the expression of scar-associated contractile protein alpha SMA in the stem cells, while significantly increasing basement membrane protein collagen 4, and also showing an improved structural assembly of elastic matrix protein elastin. So in summary, the study shows that the gene-activated scaffold is able to promote good cell proliferation and significantly prolong the stemness of the stem cells, produces an anti-fibrotic response by significant increase in TGF-beta3, enhances the paracrine pro-angiogenic activity while significantly reducing pro-fibrotic responses by reducing collagen 1 expression in fibroblasts, as well as reducing the expression of alpha smooth muscle actin. And it also improves the regeneration of tissues by deposition of collagen 4 and elastic matrix protein. So this all shows that the stem cells within the gene-activated scaffold produces and controls signaling towards scarless healing. With this, I would like to conclude that the stem cells with the gene-activated scaffold construct is a potential graft for scarless wound healing applications. And I would like to thank the School of Postgraduate Studies, Rcsi Bahrain, for the research funding, and our tissue engineering research group in Rcsi Dublin for all their support over the years. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Ashan. It was a very interesting talk. So the questions are coming in now. The first is, the scaffold that you're using, does it depend on the type of collagen?
Yes, so this scaffold is actually very similar to the commercially available, one of the first scaffold developed for skin regeneration, developed by Professor Yanas, and commercially available now is Integra. It's a mixture of collagen 1 and chondroitin sulfate, which is a glucose aminoglycan.
The second question that's come in is, how would the findings be translated to the clinical setting? It's perhaps not a fair question for you, but it's been posed.
So we want to use, ideally we would like to study, but we would like to first try an animal model. So most of the things that we have, the material that we use are already FDA approved. There are so many gene delivery studies going on, and the vector that we use, a polyethylenamine, is considered safe for human application as well. So the only thing that is challenging is to have an off-the-shelf at the moment, but it's definitely translatable, I believe.
Okay, you showed that there was an increase in fibroblasts. Someone said, is it possible it could lead to increased scarring?
So normally scarring is a normal process during the wound healing, but we don't want to drive them towards, drive them over, like over scarring. So we want to control the scarring process, and what happens with the medium from the stem cells with the gene-activated scaffold is it reduces the deposition of or the expression of the collagen 1 in the fibroblast. So that is one parameter that will reduce the scarring process during the wound healing.
And we're running out of time, but there's one final question, in that you showed this pro-angiogenic activity. Could it lead to unregulated cell proliferation?
That's a very good question, Professor, which is why I showed 2 time points where, although there was a very significant increase in angiogenesis during the early time point, there was no further increase by day 14. It kind of stayed as it is, comparable. So it's not driving excessive angiogenesis. Again, excessive angiogenesis can lead to scarring, which is unfavorable. So,
yeah. Ashank, thank you very much indeed for your presentation and your answering the questions. Please. Thank you. So our third presentation today is by Fathi Mustafa on the diagnostic performance of SARS-CoV-2 nasal antigen test in mildly symptomatic cases. So I invite Fatih to actually give his presentation now, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, good morning. My name is Fatih Mustafa, and I'm here today to talk about how the National Task Force team assessed the effect of the nasal antigen test in mild symptomatic cases and compared it to the real-time PCR, which is the gold standard, to determine if we can use it in the public and in the healthcare centers to ease up the process of reopening and tackle this pandemic. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next one. Next slide. So I'm going to start with why do we need the rapid antigen test? The nasopharyngeal real-time PCR is highly sensitive and highly specific in diagnosing COVID-19 in all suspected cases. But the problem with it that it's time-consuming and it requires specialized lab technicians and specialized equipment. And frankly, it's also very irritating when it comes to obtaining the nasopharyngeal sample. So we need a readily available test that can be bought anywhere. It's available everywhere for the public. It needs to be cost effective and rapid. And that's why we decided to test the rapid antigen test for point of care testing. So the importance of this is that it can be used in mildly symptomatic cases that they can use it at home or even in healthcare centers by GPs, and isolate possible positive cases until the actual test, which is the real-time PCR, confirms the results. Next slide, please. So what did we do, basically? So we used the National Testing Center, the symptomatic hall, and cases that presented to this hall with symptoms that we classified as mild symptoms based on the Bahrain's COVID-19 national protocols, which can you see in this slide. They presented to the center, and then 2 swabs were taken, one nasal sample and one nasopharyngeal sample. The nasal sample for the rapid antigen test and the nasopharyngeal sample for the PCR. The only difference, and of course the technique was based on the CDC guidelines in obtaining the samples, but the only difference between the guidelines and what our people did is that they used the nasopharyngeal sample provided with the rapid antigen test kit instead of a nasal swab, which is provided with the kit, and it's easier to use. Of course, the samples were collected between July and late September, and the symptom onset ranged from 0 to 14 days. Next slide, please. So what did we find? After we conducted our the statistical analysis, 733 cases were confirmed positive by the PCR. Out of these 733 cases, 602 cases were detected by the antigen test. So the sensitivity was around 82.1%, and the specificity was around 99.1%. And we also calculated the the positive predictive value and the negative predictive value, and also Kappa's coefficient of agreement. And as you can see, it's 0.859, and this is statistically significant. And it indicates that there is a correlation, or there is an almost complete agreement between the PCR and the rapid antigen test. Next slide, please. So we suspected that the duration of symptom onset and the value of CT could be confounders. So we performed a further stratified analysis. And we, as you can see here, the symptom onset within 5 days, and also we did another one for 7 days, and there was not much improvement in the sensitivity. However, when we combined the symptom onset within 5 days and the CT value less than 30 in one category, there was a significant improvement in the sensitivity of the rapid antigen test from 82.1% to 86.3%, and it even improved more when the cutoff CT value was even reduced to to less than 24, plus the symptom onset within 5 days. And this also improved the rapid antigen test sensitivity even further to 89.5%. Next slide, please. So when we compared our results with the current literature, there were many papers published about the rapid antigen test. However, there were different brands. So when we compared the specificities, we used mainly the reviews, statistical meta-analysis and systematic reviews. And there was a review that had presented the pooled sensitivity of 9 different studies of different rapid antigen test brands, and the pooled specificity was matching with our test's specificity. However, our test specificity was sensitivity was higher than the pooled sensitivity of the combined studies. When we checked other higher quality studies, we found the sensitivity to quite similar to our own test sensitivity. So given these results, we wanted to develop an algorithm that we can use to increase the effectiveness of the rapid antigen test used by the general population and the GP and the general population, and also to ease up the process and to decrease the workload on healthcare workers. So we also we used the European CDC as a reference, and they recommended that the test must be done within 7 days in symptomatic patients, and if the test is negative, we need to repeat it. We repeat to do a real-time PCR directly, or if the PCR is not available, you can just repeat the test again after a couple of days to give time for the viral load to increase. And if it's positive, then it must be confirmed directly via PCR. So what we recommended is to use it within 7 days, and if it was negative, to wait for a couple of days and then repeat the rapid antigen test. And if it was positive, to go and do the PCR. Of course, the Ministry of Health provided a clear instructions video with a leaflet that states or that explicitly states which symptoms that you must have, or to guide the people when to do the test and what to do. So they need, after they do the test, they need to call 444 and present test results, and then they will tell them what to do next. Of course, this algorithm cannot be implemented yet because we need still to further study the amount of time needed to repeat the test to make sure we have the least amount of false negatives, and this will increase the sensitivity of the test later and will help us to detect positive cases early enough to isolate them and reduce the spread to other individuals in the community. And furthermore, when I used to visit the health centers in my rotation, I saw that GPs are using the rapid antigen test as a point of care test in suspected cases before completing or continuing the consultation, which would also be safe, considered safe practice for the safety of our GPs and nurses. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Fatih. Very, very interesting data indeed. So what you actually did there was all in symptomatic patients, yes?
Yes, mildly symptomatic patients, so specific symptoms. So
in fact, one of the questions that have come in is, do you think that this is a very useful test for use in mass populations, perhaps, for someone, say, attending a football stadium or something like that?
Yes, so that was what we wanted to do as well, and we wanted to develop an algorithm for that. But given the amount of false negatives we had in our study, we decided that we need to do further testing, and we need to do another study on asymptomatic individuals as well, to check how it can detect it in asymptomatic individuals before we start implementing it or using it in mass events, for example, before weddings or conferences. So we still need further testing before we use that test.
In Ramadan, it could be very useful for everyone to be tested just before breaking of the fast.
Yeah.
So, and I missed it potentially from your presentation, but there's a question here. How many people were symptomatic, had a negative test, and then subsequent tests showed that they were positive?
Okay, so we had 30 in the patients, 30 cases that were false negative, and only 22 of them agreed to repeat the test again after a couple of days, and 77.1% of them became positive.
And do you know, on the kind of as the disease progresses, how long you have to be infected before the antigen test actually is positive?
For us, for our study, the median duration of symptom onset was 2 days. So most of the cases were around 2 days. So I think 2 days will be enough to detect the antigen. However, also there are some cases that needs more time. So it depends on the case itself.
So again, the need for repeated testing if there's...
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Fatih, thank you very much indeed for your presentation and for answering questions so clearly. Thank you. Could I have the next slide, please? Next slide. Right, that's it. Super. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so our fourth presentation is Dr. Nitya Kumar, who's going to be talking about time till viral clearance of SARS-CoV-2 is similar for asymptomatic and non-critically symptomatic individuals. So I turn the floor over to you, Nitya.
Thank you for the introduction, Chair. Good morning, everyone. So I will be speaking about time till viral clearance for SARS-CoV-2 for asymptomatic and non-critically symptomatic individuals. Next slide, please. So it has been a year since the coronavirus disease 2019 or COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, and even till now, the extent to which asymptomatic infections fuel this epidemic has not been reported enough. And this would be a very useful insight because asymptomatic infections are believed to be partly responsible for the rise in cases following ease in public gathering restrictions that we are seeing worldwide, even recently in Bahrain. Modeling estimates and primary research studies place this proportion anywhere between 6 to 30% in various settings. However, till now, no study has reported the actual time for which an individual infected with SARS-CoV-2 tests positive. So next slide, please. So this study was done to estimate exactly that, which is time till viral clearance of SARS-CoV-2, which is nothing but the time till an individual tests positive for SARS-CoV-2. And then we also aim to compare this number between those who develop symptoms and those who remain asymptomatic. Next slide, please. So we considered a study population of all the passengers who arrived in Bahrain between February 25th and 14th March of 2020. All of them underwent a mandatory COVID-19 screening, which included documenting symptoms as well as nasopharyngeal swab testing using RT-PCR. After which all of them underwent a 14-day quarantine. And during this time, anyone who developed symptoms was categorized as symptomatic, and anybody who remained without symptoms was categorized as asymptomatic. The outcome here was viral clearance, which was defined as 2 consecutive negative RT-PCR tests 24 hours apart. And to assess this outcome, RT-PCR was done every 2 days in everybody till viral clearance occurred. Next slide, please. So here's what we found. We screened 2,714 passengers, of which 184 tested positive at various times. Next slide, please. Of all those who tested positive, some of the figures are not showing up here. 145 of all these study subjects were asymptomatic. This constituted more than 78%. And most of these study subjects were females. And those who were in the age group of 50 to 59 years were higher in proportion compared to younger age groups. Next slide, please. So what we did was, using the duration for which each individual remains positive, we estimated the hazards of viral clearance for each individual. And on the slides, you can see the values are hazard ratios comparing males to females, older age groups to the youngest age category of 0 to 29 years, and symptomatic individuals to asymptomatic. We did not find any sex differences in the hazards of viral clearance. We did find individuals who are 60 years or older to have higher or longer duration till viral clearance compared to younger individuals. And the most remarkable finding here was that symptomatic individuals had the same duration or hazards of viral clearance compared to asymptomatic individuals. Students of medicine would be familiar with this plot. It's a forest plot, and the vertical line in the center indicates no association, and the hazard ratio for symptomatic individual fell promptly around the vertical line, indicating no association. Next slide, please. So the duration, the actual duration of viral clearance was estimated to be 11 days, which was the median value, and was same for symptomatic and asymptomatic individuals. What we can see on the slide here is the survival curves representing the same. And we can see that both the survival curves have a remarkable overlap between subclinical and overt infections after controlling for age and sex. Next slide, please. So the key finding here is that viral positivity, the duration for which a person tests positive for SARS-CoV-2, was similar regardless of the fact that whether a person developed symptoms after accounting for the effects of age and sex. And so far in the literature, studies have only reported this number for those who develop symptoms, and our numbers are similar to those. There have also been studies who have reported higher numbers in symptomatic individuals in cases where the study subjects were highly symptomatic, hospitalized, critical patients. But the key critical assessment here is that we found the duration of viral clearance to be similar between symptomatic and asymptomatic people, and others have found the viral loads to be similar between these categories of people. So a key question that arises here is the duration of infectiousness also similar? Next slide, please. So this is a first of its kind study to report the duration of viral clearance in asymptomatic people, and to report that it's similar to those with symptoms and who are non-critically ill. But we would have to mention some caveats here, is that in people who were symptomatic upon arriving in Bahrain, we were not able to estimate the duration for which they remained pre-symptomatic before they arrived in Bahrain. And that could have influenced the estimates of median time till viral clearance. In addition, the caveat of the RT-PCR test itself, which in cases where there is shedding of non-viable virus, detects that as a positive case. So we were not able to ascertain what fraction of asymptomatic versus symptomatic people were shedding non-viable virus here. Next slide, please. In conclusion, the findings from this study shed light on how asymptomatic spread can still be a substantial risk. And this underscores the importance of not easing public health preventative measures, especially restrictions on mass gathering indoors and opening of businesses that would make adherence to these measures difficult. Next slide, please. We are incredibly thankful to the Rcsi Bahrain Research Office as well as the Bahrain National COVID-19 Task Force who made this study possible. The findings have been accepted for publication in the journal Frontiers in Medicine. I'd be delighted to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Nitya, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. There's been a couple of questions that have come in. The first is, did you find any ethnic differences in your population looked at?
We did take a brief look at the ethnic distribution. So most predominantly the population were from Egypt and Iran. So there wasn't enough number of people who varied to enable statistically powered analysis, which is why we did not look at that in the model. But thank you for the question.
I mean, there was a large number of patients. Do you think that you still had sufficient power to robustly kind of give your findings?
I would say yes, because 182 is a good enough number for the number of variables we used in the model, which is just 3. So yes, it was sufficiently statistically powered.
And did you get any indication at all why the viral clearance appeared to be longer in the patients who were over 60? Is it because they had other comorbidities, or wasn't it looked at?
No, we did not look at this information in this particular analysis, but that would be quite interesting to look at. Yes. You're on mute, Professor Atkin.
Sorry. So are you saying from a practical point of view, if you're testing positive, PCR positive, and you are relatively asymptomatic, but you need a negative test, you should wait till after 14 days?
I would not comment on that. I would leave it to infectious disease experts. But at the time, my research just raises this question. If you see an asymptomatic person and a symptomatic person out on the streets, they're equally likely to be positive.
That's very nicely put. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Nevin, could I have the next slide, please? And the next slide. Thank you very much indeed. Our 5th presentation today is from Saad Mala, and it is using CT values to predict the future trajectory of COVID-19, new daily cases, a multi-center cross-sectional study. Saad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Stephen. My name is Saad, and I'm happy to be here today. Next slide, please. Okay, so as part of the COVID-19 task force under Professor Manaf al-Qahtani, we tried to look at whether CT values can be used as a forecasting tool. Next slide, please. So some important background information. Now, as you all know quite too well, unfortunately, COVID-19 is diagnosed through nasopharyngeal swabs. Now, these swabs are then placed into a PCR machine. These PCR machines, now COVID-19 obviously is a RNA virus, right? And we use this because it commonly colonizes the nasopharynx. And so the PCR machine will reverse transcribe the RNA into DNA and then amplify it. It will amplify it until it reaches a concentration that is detectable by the machine. So how many cycles of amplifications we need to reach that concentration that is detectable is referred to as the cycle threshold value, which I will be referring to as the CT value throughout. So you can already start seeing that there's a correlation here, because that means that the lower the CT value, or the lower the number of cycles necessary, the higher the viral load. And that means that the host has more virus within their system. So what we don't know, however, is whether that also means higher infectivity and higher transmissibility. And if it does, because there are some recent studies that look at it from a clinical standpoint, for example, disease severity of patients who have more viral load. But what we don't know, not just with COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, but with any other virus, is whether it is to look at it from an epidemiologic perspective, to find out whether we can use the mass viral load of a population on a large scale to predict the number of cases at a later date. Because the hypothesis here is that if you have more viral loads in positive cases, that means there's more virus being shed in the environment, and more virus being shed in the environment means that there's a higher chance of reaching an infectious dose to get COVID-19 infection. And so obviously forecasting the epidemic, and COVID-19 obviously gave a great opportunity for us to be able to do this research, and that's probably why it hasn't been done with other viruses. But what's great about this is that not just scientists, but even members of the public and also government officials, it's been their pursuit, their number one pursuit, to be able to forecast the number of cases so that we can act fast and act responsibly. So next slide, please. So, like I mentioned, the aim of the study was to investigate any population-wide changes in SARS-CoV-2 RT-PCR CT values over time, and whether that's associated with the daily fraction of positive COVID-19 tests. We also had a secondary objective to identify any other factors that might influence CT values or viral load. And on a tertiary level, this was more of a pilot study to a larger study later on to develop a predictive model that we can use using such a basic and available tool in every country. Regardless of how much resources they have, it's a very easy metric to use. Next slide, please. So how did we do it? So we had a retrospective cross-sectional study, and all COVID-19 facilities in Bahrain from May 4th to September 30, 2020. Our population was extremely heterogeneous in terms of positive cases. So we had healthcare workers who obviously are screened often. We had random population testing. We had travelers. We had symptomatic patients, and all of these formed our cohort. So data collected included things like CD values, age, gender, nationality, and of course symptomatic status. And we analyzed the main endpoints with Pearson correlation analysis, then stratified for gender and nationality, and used a linear regression to identify the best predictive model. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So we had 63,833 cases, which is a very large number for us to play around with. So that was nice to see. In terms of CT values, we found them to be negatively and very weakly correlated with the fraction of daily positive cases with an R of negative 0.06. Now the R squared for the regression model, once we adjusted for age and number of daily tests, showed an accuracy of 45.3%. So in terms of association, CT values were associated with nationality, which I'll get to later on. And after stratification, this association in the regression model between CT values and fraction of positive cases was only maintained for the female gender and Bahraini nationality. In terms of symptomatic presentation, it was significantly associated with a lower CT value. So in other words, the higher the viral load, the more likely that you will present with symptoms. And CT values also did not show any significant correlation with age or gender. Next slide, please. So some sample characteristics. Just one thing to point out is the symptomatic rate. So we had 35% only being symptomatic out of a 63,000. So you can see here there's a huge portion that was asymptomatic, and I'll also discuss that later on. As well, the majority of the cohort was male. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned, for the regression model, the significance was only maintained for CT values and daily tests, and age was not a confounder in the model. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is probably my proudest visualization here, because what we did here is that we tried to standardize two things: the mean CT value as a Z-score and the 1 week lead on the percentage of positive cases. So why 1 week lead? We all know that the incubation period of COVID-19 is around 1 to 2 weeks, right? And so what we did is that we played around with how many days we're looking at after the day that we tested the CT value. So for example, if look at week 15, on week 15, if we see that the CT values, the average CT value for that week is, for example, 25, we look at the number of cases 1 week after that date. And we looked at 2 weeks, we looked at more, 3 weeks, and we found 1 week to have the best association between CT value and the number of cases 1 week ahead from that date. So you can see beautifully here, when the CT value in blue peaks, which means that there's a decrease in viral load, there's also a decrease in the percentage of positive cases 1 week after that date. So it was a very, very, very nice trend. Next slide, please. Okay, so like I mentioned, we had one of the highest asymptomatic rates reported in the literature. Why is that? Probably because Bahrain had a very comprehensive testing and screening policies. Like I mentioned, it wasn't just symptomatic patients that are being tested. In most countries that are resource deprived, they will be only testing people who present with symptoms. For us, we had a lot of buses for random screening. We had travelers and healthcare workers and a lot of people, which may have led to the high asymptomatic percentage, which obviously is like my colleague was discussing, is something that shows that COVID-19 is more asymptomatic than we maybe thought from other data. So, like I mentioned, there wasn't any studies or many studies on this as of date, and so that was very hard to compare with other institutions. We did partner with Harvard's public health school, who were working on a similar project, and our data was very similar in the sense of having CT values being negatively correlated with the number of daily cases. Now, why this correlation did not hold for Bahrainis for non-Bahrainis and males? Well, non-Bahrainis and males form a very unique cohort in Bahrain, which is the migrant workers, and migrant workers were truly a very unique and a very unique group of the population that formed an outlier, especially at the beginning of the outbreak, because they had their unique cluster transmission within the buildings that they were living in. They would present to the healthcare department at a much later time. So they would seek healthcare at a much later date than Bahrainis did. And so they were an outlier. And once we removed them or looked at their association later on during the pandemic, after there were interventions that took place, that association started holding up. And so also in terms of why asymptomatic cases presented with higher CT values, this is obviously we need more studies on that, more basic science and more clinical studies on it. But it's likely due to a pathophysiologic mechanism here, where the lower the viral load, the less likely that you'll have an immune reaction or that the virus will have an impact on the host and present symptomatically. Next slide, please. So obviously there are some limitations for this study. It remains a national one in a small country. We need global, because this is an epidemiologic study and there's no better way to find correlations and causations and explore these things except with multi-center and multinational research. And so we need more of that. Also, we had bias. So bias was involved in something that we couldn't always control for, like poor methods of swab collection can affect these factors, and also time from symptom onset, which we couldn't control for completely, may have been a factor, and that's something for future studies. From a statistical standpoint, the CT values were stable throughout the period, and from a statistical standpoint, in order to find a correlation, you want variation, and so the more variation there is, the better for us to find a correlation. Next slide, please. So what does this mean moving forward? This emphasizes the idea that we need to maybe start considering a more gradual nature for our public health campaigns rather than an all or none approach. So instead of saying 6 feet distance, for example, so maximize distance to minimize exposure. And that's something that we need to keep in mind as well. Next slide, please. So yeah, thank you. Our paper is as a preprint available and and you can see some of the news coverage for the paper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Was there any seasonal differences in the figures that you actually showed?
So the problem with this question, which was a very good one, but when we looked at our data, there were definitely a lot of seasonal problems. Seasonal changes, and you'll find the correlation was more significant in the last 8 weeks rather than the first 8 weeks, and that's just probably due to the changes in our response, the changes in the public health actions that were happening, and we did justify a lot of them or give possible justifications, but there's really no way to know what exactly may have impacted the changes, but there were changes.
And did the data change with viral mutation?
So we did not look at viral mutations because that was earlier on in 2020. So we didn't look at the later part of 2021 or 2020.
And thirdly, and finally, really, was there any sampling bias depending on the location in Bahrain?
So there was one of the limitations as well is that we found out later on that there were some differences in the PCR machines that were being used in different institutes, and so we tried to look for confoundings and stratify that. We didn't find any significant bias that would impact the data, but like I said, it's always a possibility, and that's why if we're able to do a more controlled follow-up, that would always be the best case.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so I have the next slide, please, Nevin. Great. So our final presenter is Dr. Yahya Mohammed Naguib to talk about light at the end of the tunnel, stem cells for the treatment of diabetic vasculopathy. The floor is yours, Dr. Yahya.
Thank you very much, Professor Atkin, and I still have enough time to say good morning, everyone. I will try to make it in time, inshallah, because this is like the foundation of a big project that was planned, but unfortunately the COVID-19 came and we had to stop for a while. Hopefully we can continue that in the very near future. So we all know that there is like a very big problem, even though during the COVID era, we know that there are like vulnerable part of the population, and those actually the above 60. And one of the major problem in that is that there is like a complexity, and most probably there are crosstalks between the pathophysiology, between like the players, key players in the pathologies, the hypertension, diabetes, and the aging process itself. So we tried here to find something that can somewhat treat most, if not all, of the underlying pathophysiologies or between diabetes, aging, and hypertension. Next, please. So next slide, please. So I will go through the introduction as fast as possible, but I have to make it clear that diabetes is quite an important health problem, and it currently affects at least more than 425 million people, plus the aging, which is also significantly driver of diabetic epidemics. So diabetes in old age is linked to higher mortality, most probably due to cardiovascular events. Older people, again with diabetes, are at high risk of micro and macro vascular complications. Next, please. We focused on a very important pathophysiological event that happens actually in the three diseases. So in aging, pathological aging, we mean, and diabetes and hypertension. So at the level of the endothelium, vascular endothelial dysfunction is quite common in all these diseases, and it could happen if actually the situation of hypertension and diabetes occurred in an older subject. So cholesterol, increased cholesterol and smoking, as well as diabetes mellitus itself and the process of aging, they decrease the vasodilatory effect of nitric oxide, and they increase actually the production of free oxygen radicals, which again disrupts the vasoconstriction, vasodilatory balance that usually occurs, and it actually contributes to most of the pathophysiological complications that results from micro and macrovascular events in these conditions. Again, the increase in the free oxygen radical may lead to lipoprotein oxidation, and it's actually a pro-inflammatory increase in the pro-inflammatory genes, and the catabolism of nitric oxide is also disrupted. Next, please. Next. Okay. So again, we focused on the endothelium because the endothelial dysfunction is important for the homeostasis of the body, and its dysfunction is associated with several pathophysiological conditions, including atherosclerosis, hypertension, and diabetes. Again, it's worsened in all population. We can now all look at the vascular endothelium as a multifunctional organ. It has secretory, it has, and it also contributes to many of the downstream pathways regulating most of the vascular function. They also produce wide range of factors that also regulate cell adhesion, thromboresistance, and smooth muscle cell proliferation, as well as vessel wall inflammation. So actually the dysfunction of this layer is quite important in elaborating most of the secrets of how to treat the other vascular related pathologies. Next, please. So as I mentioned, they are metabolically active with important paracrine, endocrine, and autocrine functions. So this is indispensable for the maintenance of vascular homeostasis under both physiological and, again, if we look at the pathology, they will be important as pharmacological targets. Next, please. So this is just a summary of the complexity of the and the polymodal action of the vascular endothelium. I will not go through it anymore. Next, please. So the disruption of the tightly regulated equilibrium between vasodilatory and vasoconstrictive molecules may lead to this endothelial dysfunction. And as I mentioned earlier, that the complexities increase in old age. So what we try to do, next slide, please. What we try to do is to find something that retains the balance between the vasodilatory and vasoconstriction functions of the endothelium, the vascular endothelium, in a hope to kind of correct what's happening in diabetes. And again, since it's underlying hypertension and the aging process, so most probably we thought that it could be like a safe, we were searching for a safe therapeutic tool that doesn't add insult to the already present pathologies. Next slide, please. So we hypothesized that we could transplant endothelial cells, differentiated endothelial cells in vitro, into a mouse model and of an age diabetic rat, and then check if this could really improve the condition. Next, please. So there were two steps. I will again go quickly through the methodology because of the time. So there were two steps. So in vitro, we isolated the human wharton jelly derived mesenchymal stem cells, and then we characterized them by checking for the CD44, which is a hallmark, and they of CD31 and CD34. And after having quite enough colonies, we did try differentiating them into endothelial cells using VEGF. And again, we kind of characterized the morphological change using the same flow cytometry method. We were successful to get CD34 and CD31 positive cells, but again, the challenge was whether they have only changed in morphology or they can also do the same function as native endothelial cells. So we did the second step, next please, which is injecting them into a diabetic model of aged rat. So we have age control rats and age diabetic rats, then we had age diabetic rats treated with endothelial cells. We did like a nice bouquet of experiments to show whether they are functioning or not. So next slide, please. So first of all, we are just showing here the successful differentiation and characterization of the cells. So we had enough fibroblast-like wharton jelly derived in endothelial mesenchymal cells. This is in A and B after differentiation, 10 days. So we had beautifully morphologically differentiated endothelial cells. And again, the characterization showed the upregulation of the CD31 and CD34, which denotes successful differentiation, at least from the morphological point of view. Next, please. Then we had to check for the successful homing, and we show here that the cells beautifully migrated to small arteries in the vascular endothelium, as well as large arteries, vascular endothelium. At the H&E level, there was much improvement in the old rats treated with endothelial cells, so there was less denudation of the vascular endothelium and less also ulceration. Most importantly, at the media layer, there was regular and smooth contour of the smooth muscles with even distribution of the collagen and elastic fibers. There was less lymphocytic infiltration in the subendothelial layer, as well as vacuolation. Next, please. So now we went to testing the functionality of those cells and to see whether they are capable of improving the underlying pathophysiological condition. So we measured the systolic blood pressure in these rats, and as we can see, there was significant decrease in the already elevated blood pressure in the diabetic rats. And we also tested the pulse wave velocity as an indicator of the retaining the elasticity and the normal response to increased blood pressure. Decrease also the atherosclerotic effect of aging, both aging and diabetes. Again, it beautifully shows that treatment with endothelial cells has almost retained the normal function of the vascular tissue. And when you looked at the peripheral resistance, we chose to measure the renal artery resistance, and that was increased in diabetic aged rats. And again, with the treatment with endothelial cells, this was almost retained to normal levels. Next, please. So in part, we wanted to know what are the general mechanisms that may also be involved, because we cannot just assume that being there is enough. So we thought that since there is a valid inflammatory and oxidative stress and angiogenesis theories, we tested that. So at the tissue level, nitric oxide production was enhanced with retaining of the normal function of the enos. The production of endothelin 1 and angiotensin 2 was almost okay. And again, we measured the TNF alpha and then interleukin 6. So there was an anti-inflammatory effect, valid effect, and also the VEGF was quite decreased after treatment. So the angiogenesis also stopped. Next, please. So as we showed here, treating quite complicated pathophysiological mechanisms that may go through the old population, the vulnerable population, needs specific treatment, something that doesn't add insult to the condition, and something that also can work on a platform that treats most of the pathophysiology of these diseases in old age. We show here that endothelial cells can be differentiated from mesenchymal cells, an easy technique, and hopefully also a potentially strategy that could be applied in humans. I just want to acknowledge my team. Next slide, please. And to show that most of these results, the part on the diabetic vasculopathy was already published in Diabetology and Metabolic Syndrome. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. The first was that you showed very nice experiments. Was there any indication that there was production of cells? In other words, you lose cellular regulation with your stem cells?
Yes, this is a very, very important question, and also a very important limitation. At that stage, we didn't check for that, but at the level of the vascular tissue, at least we were sure that this is not valid, because the VEGF level was actually decreased. So angiogenesis stopped in our hands.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid we're going to have to move on because we are now out of time. Thank you very much for a very elegant presentation. If I could have the next slide, please, Nevin. Okay, well, I think that we would all agree entirely that each of the presentations was excellent and very, very different in their nature. And as a consequence, it's very difficult to award prizes when there's such a disparity between the types of presentation and the subjects. And therefore, we've decided that the best thing to do is to award prizes for all 6 of the presentations. equally, together with a certificate of excellence. And I'd like to thank the presenters once again for the excellent quality of the presentations and the diversity. So thank you very much indeed. Can I have the next slide, please? And finally, I'd like to thank you, the audience, the presenters from the plenary session, the presenters for the abstracts, for your attendance. And I would once again like to thank His Excellency, Lieutenant General Dr. Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdullah Al Khalifa, Chairman of the Supreme Council of Health, for his patronage of this RCSI Bahrain conference. Thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.